Welcome back, Natural Resources. I feel like we have been kind of dancing around this whole natural resources thing by doing all this leadership and SAE and career stuff, but we're finally going to start talking about natural resources this week. First thing we'll do is this Introduction to Natural Resources unit. We will just spend this week on the unit. It's some basic terminology and some impacts of humans on the environment, and then we will start next week on forestry. So once we get to that forestry unit, be prepared to be outside. For those of you who are in cohort A and B, and those of you who are remote students, you might have to actually go and do a little bit of exploring outside on your own. So that's just kind of a little heads up about what's coming up next. But first, let's talk about this Introduction to Natural Resources unit. We're going to look at some terminology here, just some things you need to be familiar with that you're going to see for the remainder of the semester. And the first one is environment. And so when we're talking about environment, we're talking about all the factors and surroundings that affect a living organism, whether that be an animal living organism, as in all of us, or a plant living organism, as in trees. So environment is just going to be whatever surrounds all of us that are living organisms. Renewable resources are going to be ones that support life and they can reproduce themselves, or they can actually be reproduced by humans. So when we talk about renewable resources, we're talking about things that we don't necessarily have to worry about giving out because it can be reproduced. So we're looking at seeds and plants and animals and things like that. So renewable resources, don't have to worry about getting rid of those because those are self-sustainable. An exhaustible resource, though, is one that can't be replaced. It's one that when it's gone, it's finished. It can't be reproduced. You can't come up with a replica of it. It's gone. So things like oil and natural gas and coal are all going to be some of those exhaustible types of resources. So you kind of keep in mind as we are looking at what we would do with things as far as environmental science goes, that we definitely want to lean more toward the natural, the renewable resources versus exhaustible resources. An ecosystem is going to be a partially contained environmental living system. So basically, it's kind of like when we look at an ecosystem, you might be looking at a desert ecosystem, or you might be looking at a swamp type ecosystem or wetlands. You might be looking at a forest type of ecosystem. And so basically, when you're looking at an ecosystem, you're looking at one specific area and anything that could live within those areas. So if we were looking at a forest, for example, as an ecosystem, or as it says here, woodland, then you would be talking about all the trees within the forest, all of the wildlife that lives within the forest, any of the mushrooms, or even lichens that would be on trees. So any birds. So anything that would live in one particular area would be included within that ecosystem. A food web. Now this looks kind of confusing here, but basically when we talk about a food web, we're talking about animals that eat other animals, that eat other animals, that eat plants, and so you're looking at the very beginning of the food chain typically being some sort of a plant type of product. And so that plant type of product is going to be consumed by some sort of a small animal typically, and then they're going to be consumed by typically some sort of a larger animal, and so on and so on. So when we're looking at the food chain, we are looking from plants to maybe insects, to smaller animals, to larger animals that would be starting out with your vegetarian type animals, your herbivore type animals, and moving on up the food chain to those animals that would only eat meat. So it basically, you can see this picture here. It's just an interwoven group of different types of animals and organisms and what would eat what. So the food web is just kind of a tangled up mess of what different types of animals would eat and consume. If you're like me, this picture is not so pleasant, and sometimes we have these stink bugs. My daddy used to call them chinch bugs, but stink bugs, whatever you want to call them, that's one particular type of invasive species. Kudzu's another type of invasive species. Mimosa trees are another type of invasive species. Fire ants, oh my gosh, an invasive species. So when we are looking at invasive species, we're looking at plants or animals that are non-native to the ecosystem. Funny little story. This time of year, that's when the fire ants start to come out. And so if you look anywhere around your yard, then you probably see some kind of fire ants somewhere. And we were talking about fire ants just at our house just last night. And fire ants are not native to the United States. They actually came in on a cargo ship through Mobile, Alabama back in the 1930s. And so I don't know what country they came from, but they came in on some cargo, were unloaded off the ship into Mobile, and have made their stinging little behinds up to our area. So they've made their way to our area, and we just can't seem to get rid of them. So those invasive species, regardless of what type you're talking about, typically are unwanted, but they do not come native from our environment. Carrying capacity is just the amount of animals or plants that an ecosystem can support. Whenever we get started with our aquaponics program and we get the catfish for our aquaponics program, there will be a certain number of catfish that we will put in that tank. And once we get above that, then we start looking at the possibility of having problems with disease because you can't keep things clean enough. We'll be providing food, but in a normal situation, carrying capacity would also include the amount of food that an animal has access to. So once you start getting too many animals in an ecosystem or too many of one particular thing in an ecosystem, it becomes dangerous for those animals, and they're more likely to have diseases and issues with parasites. That's one of the reasons why we have hunting and fishing laws, so that people can help to reduce the amount of an animal that's in a certain area, to make sure that the carrying capacity is not exceeded. Sustainability. Here we're basically talking about humans and nature existing in harmony, and trying to make sure that we are maintaining a clean environment for future generations. So when we're looking at sustainability, we are specifically looking at the idea of making sure that we are taking care of things. A lot of people, when they think about sustainability, they think about organics, they think about rotational crops, they think about no-till crops, and basically you're just trying to preserve as much of the land as possible in order to help save it and sustain it for future generations. The next term is soil, and I would assume that all of you know what soil is. But when we look at soil, we'll spend some time looking at soil because we'll have an entire unit on it. When you look at this, what we call a soil profile that's in this picture on this slide, you notice that there are different layers within the picture. You see the top part of the picture where there is some root or organic material. It's much darker. Then you start getting into the next horizon where it's a little more brown, and then you get down into that kind of orange area, and then finally the sea horizon we'll talk about a little bit later on. But we'll spend a lot of time looking at soils That will probably be the thing that we go to after we finish with forestry. And we'll be looking at different types of soils that are in different places around the state. But basically, you're just looking at a layer of natural materials, has organic and inorganic materials in there, and is hopefully going to be capable of supporting life because we need things to be planted in those. Water is next, and I would assume that all of you know what water is. It's just a colorless, transparent compound that's made of hydrogen and oxygen, and we will be talking much more about water as we go throughout the semester as well. Fish and Wildlife specifically talks about any animal that is non-domesticated. So we're not talking about your puppy dogs and your cats and your horses and things like that. We're talking about animals that are wild animals, game type animals, wildlife type animals. So when we look at the act of domestication, we're basically taming a species of animals. So a domesticated animal would be something that has been tamed for human benefit, whereas these fish and wildlife, we're specifically talking about species that have not been tamed for human use or for human benefit. A forest, oh, that's a pretty forest. I like that picture. It's just an area covered with trees and undergrowth, and we will spend some time doing some forestry pretty soon. And hopefully, even when you are not in class, if you're cohort A or B, you'll have an opportunity to get out into the forest and see some of the things that we'll be talking about in class. Minerals are inorganic compounds. These naturally occur in the earth, and they typically have got some sort of a distinctive shape or structure. And in our part of the state, if you go up in the mountain area, there's a lot of places where they have gem mines and things like that. And you actually, the whole purpose behind those types of things is to extract some of the minerals and gems that are available in our particular area. But being inorganic, these are non-living, and so they are naturally occurring in the earth and typically are dug up during excavations. And finally, the last term is going to be fossil fuel. And so when we talk about the term fossil fuel, we're looking at things that are created because of the decomposition of dead plants and animals. So when we look at those renewable resources and things like that, there are some things that are actually going to be recreated and renewable, but it takes a tremendous amount of time for that kind of thing to happen. So when we're looking at things like coal and oil and stuff like that, it is going to come from decomposition, but that is going to take many, many generations typically for something like that to happen. And we are going to stop right there. That's just some terminology that you need to be familiar with. And we will be looking at these terms throughout the course of the semester, and we'll be using them in lots of different units. So please make sure to ask any questions that you may have. Make sure that you email me if you have questions about anything, and I will talk to you soon.